The sky was dark and filled with heavy clouds and broken light from faraway stars, and in the middle of this cold, alien land walked a lone human man wearing his old survival suit, which was scratched and patched from many journeys, and he held a scanner in his hand that blinked slowly as he followed its weak signal across the sharp, rocky terrain and melted metal pieces. This place was supposed to be empty and dead with no life signs and no energy pulses, and yet his scanner kept showing movement like a weak heartbeat hidden behind layers of silence and ashes, and every step he took made him feel closer to something he could not explain with science or logic or training. He passed a half-burnt escape pod with its side torn open, and wires hanging out like black vines, and near it was a pile of broken containers and scorched equipment, and suddenly he heard it again. A soft sound like someone breathing very quietly, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it was not the wind. He stopped walking and turned his head, slowly listening with all his senses awake and alert, and there it was again, a sound so fragile it could break at any second, and it came from behind a collapsed wing covered in dust and soot, and with slow, careful steps he moved closer, unsure what he would find. His flashlight beam shook slightly as he moved it toward the shadow, and what he saw made his chest tighten and his breath catch in his throat, because it was not a machine or a trick of light or a dying animal, but a girl, and not a human girl, but an alien one. She was small and thin, and her skin had a pale blue shade with glowing silver lines moving like soft pulses on her face and arms, and her clothes were torn and too big for her, and her silver hair was tangled and dirty, and her eyes looked up at him without fear, just sadness and hunger and something deeper. She did not move or speak or hide. She just stared as if she was ready for whatever came next, and the human looked at her and saw not an enemy or a threat, but a child who had suffered and been left behind, and he felt something inside him shift. He slowly lowered his weapon and took off his pack and unzipped it with steady hands and pulled out a small meal bar wrapped in thin plastic, and he opened it and took a bite himself, and then gently extended it toward her without saying a word at first. Watched his hand as if it was something from another world, which it was, and after a few long seconds her fingers twitched and her hand reached out shaky and weak, and she grabbed the food, but her grip was loose and it fell from her hand. He picked it up and gave it to her again, and this time she held it tightly and brought it to her mouth and took the smallest bite possible, like someone who was afraid it would vanish if she bit too fast, and as soon as the taste hit her tongue she froze. Then her eyes filled with tears, not human tears, but soft glowing ones that shimmered as they rolled down her cheeks. And she held the food close and sobbed quietly, like her whole body was made of broken glass that finally cracked open. The human said nothing and just sat beside her on the cold metal floor and watched her eat slowly, as if every bite was a miracle. And he knew this was more than a rescue. This was the start of something he did not understand, yet he wanted to ask who she was and what happened and why she was alone on a dead planet in a crashed ship, but he said nothing because he knew she was not ready, and maybe he was not ready either. They sat in silence with only the sound of the wind and her quiet breathing and the soft crinkle of the food wrapper as she took one bite at a time with great care, like someone who had learned not to hope for anything and now found herself hoping again. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small thermal blanket and placed it around her shoulders gently, and she flinched at first, then relaxed as the warmth wrapped around her thin frame like a memory of comfort long forgotten. She looked at him again, and this time her eyes said thank you without words, and he nodded once without speaking, and in that moment something passed between them like a silent promise made without language or gesture. Night was falling fast, and the temperature was dropping, and the scanner beeped again weakly, but he ignored it because right now nothing mattered more than this girl and the fact that she was alive and that she had not given up completely. He did not know her name or where she came from or what she had lost, but he knew she had been through something terrible, and still she had survived, and now she was here with him, and that meant something. In the distance the sky rumbled and the wind picked up and the stars blinked like silent watchers, and he looked at her and knew that this was just the beginning of a story that would change both of their lives forever. The morning light came slowly and spread across the broken ship like a soft blanket, touching every sharp edge and cracked wall, and inside the silent shell of metal the human sat awake, watching the alien girl as she slept curled up under the thermal blanket, breathing slow and calm for the first time since he found her. He had not slept because his mind was full of questions and thoughts and fears and hope, and he kept listening to every sound outside and inside, and even the wind seemed to carry whispers of danger, or maybe that was just his nerves playing tricks on him. He glanced at his wrist screen and saw the local temperature rising slightly, which meant he had a few hours to move before the heat waves returned and made walking dangerous, but he could not move yet, not without knowing more about the girl, and if she was strong enough to walk. The girl stirred and blinked her glowing eyes and looked around in confusion, like someone who forgot where they were, and when her gaze landed on the human, she froze for a moment, then slowly sat up, still holding the half-eaten meal bar like it was treasure. The human gave her a small nod and pulled out a small water pouch and handed it to her, and she took it with both hands and drank carefully, and when she finished, she looked at him again with a mixture of fear and trust and something that looked like silent curiosity. He took a small pad from his pocket and drew a symbol with his finger, the symbol for friend, and showed it to her, and waited, and after a few seconds she nodded very slowly and used her own finger to draw something in return, a spiral with lines like branches, and he had no idea what it meant, but he smiled and placed a hand on his chest and said his name slowly and clearly, and then pointed at her, waiting for a response, and after a long pause, she whispered something in her language. A name maybe, or just a sound that held meaning, and he repeated it the best he could. She gave a tiny nod and hugged the blanket tighter around herself and looked away, like the weight of remembering her name had brought back pain, and he respected that and stood up and walked a few steps away, giving her space to breathe outside the wreck. The wind was dry and the sky was turning orange and gold, and he knew staying too long here would be risky, but he also knew moving her now, without knowing her condition, could be worse, so he walked back inside and sat down beside her again. He reached into his bag and took out a small scanner and gently gestured if he could check her health, and she nodded once and stayed still as he moved the device slowly around her. It beeped softly and showed signs of weakness, dehydration and mild infection, nothing deadly, but she needed care soon. He tapped the screen and showed her the red warning, and she looked at it and then at him, and he pointed at a location on his map where his small outpost was hidden under the ground, not far but too far for someone so weak to walk alone. She looked unsure and scared, and he understood that, so he took out another energy bar and gave it to her and said one word together and waited, and finally she nodded again very slowly and reached out her hand. He helped her stand, and she wobbled like a leaf in the wind, but he caught her gently and held her steady, and she leaned on him without words, without protest, as if she had already used all her strength and now had no choice but to trust. They moved slowly across the wreckage, with every step careful and silent, and the sun climbed higher and the heat began to rise, and the human kept his pace slow, matching her steps and shielding her from the wind with his own body. She said nothing, but her eyes kept watching everything like a bird afraid of traps or shadows, and he could feel the tension in her frame and knew she had seen things no one should see and lived through things no one should face alone. When they reached a narrow path between two rocks, he stopped and held her back and crouched low and scanned the area ahead, and his screen blinked with a faint signal. Something mechanical buried nearby, maybe a drone, maybe something worse. He turned to her and held a finger to his lips, and she understood immediately, crouching low beside him, and they waited together behind a stone, and the sound of a small engine passed overhead fast and sharp and then faded away into the sky. After a long pause, he looked at her, and she looked at him, and they both exhaled in silence and continued moving, and finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the edge of a shallow valley where his hidden outpost was marked by a false rock that he pushed aside with effort. They entered a small tunnel lit by dim lights, and she flinched at the sudden change but followed him down into the cooler air and finally into a round chamber with supplies and bedding and water and safety. And when he turned to her, he saw her expression change. It was still guarded and unsure, but there was something else too, something like hope trying to grow in dry soil. And when he offered her a seat and food and water again, she took it with both hands and looked at him, not like a stranger, but like someone she might begin to trust. The outpost was small but strong, built with care and hidden well beneath the rocks and metal scrap, and inside Its thick walls, the air was cool and clean, and the lights hummed gently above as the human moved around checking supplies and adjusting settings, while the alien girl sat on a padded seat watching everything with wide, silent eyes that missed nothing. She had not spoken again. Not even a whisper, but her eyes asked questions and her body stayed alert as if danger might still come through. The wolves, and every time the human moved too fast, she flinched, just a little though. She tried to hide it, and he noticed it each time and slowed his movements to give her peace. He pulled out a clean shirt and pants from a storage box and laid them gently near her, pointing with a soft nod, and then turned away, giving her privacy. And while he worked at the small stove heating a meal, he heard the faint rustle of cloth behind him and smiled quietly, knowing she was beginning to accept his help when she appeared again, wearing the oversized clothes with sleeves hanging past her hands and pants rolled at the bottom. She looked like a shadow of herself, but also a little more alive, and she held her old clothes in a bundle, unsure what to do, and he walked over and took them gently, placing them in a cleaning unit. He offered her the warm meal on a metal tray, and she took it slowly, bringing it to her lap and sniffing it carefully, and then tasting one bite and then another, and he sat across from her and ate his own food in silence, letting the moment speak louder than words. And for the first time since he found her, she looked almost calm. Hours passed, and the outpost remained quiet and safe, and the scanner showed no threats nearby. And the sun above shifted and faded, and outside the wind howled against the hills. But inside everything stayed still and peaceful, and the girl fell asleep again, this time on a soft bed wrapped in a clean blanket, her breathing steady and slow. The human sat at the control desk typing notes into his log, marking the strange signals he picked up and the odd energy signatures near the crash site and the strange shape he saw on the scanner just before leaving. And he knew this was not random, that someone or something was involved, and that the girl was not just a survivor but a target. He looked at her sleeping form and felt a strange pull, a sense of duty that went beyond orders or missions, and he knew that keeping her safe was now more than just kindness. It was something personal, something important, and he would protect her no matter what came next. Next morning, she woke before him and moved quietly around the room, exploring the shelves and blinking at the strange tools and blinking lights. And when he opened his eyes, he found her standing near a display screen watching the stars outside, and he walked over slowly and stood beside her. Saying nothing, she pointed at one of the stars and then drew a pattern in the air with her finger, and he recognized it from old maps, a system far from here, marked with warning signs and old stories of war. And he looked at her face and saw fear and pain, and knew that was where she came from, or where she escaped from. He pulled up the map and showed her a safe zone, a place known for peace and protection, and she shook her head quickly, then drew an X over it, and then pointed down toward a darker part of the map, unmarked and unknown, and her eyes told him they had to go. They're not away from danger, but toward it. He did not understand why, but he nodded slowly and began checking fuel cells and engine status and food packs, because he knew the look in her eyes, and it was the look of someone running toward something they had to face no matter the cost. She helped him pack the supplies, moving with more energy now, and when she accidentally dropped a tool and laughed a tiny broken laugh, it felt like light had entered the room, and he looked at her with new respect, knowing she was not just a lost girl but something much stronger. As they loaded the small ship hidden at the back of the outpost, he felt a mix of worry and purpose, and when she stepped into the cabin and sat beside him, without hesitation he knew she was ready, and that whatever was waiting out there, they would face it together. The engines roared softly, and the ship lifted into the sky, leaving the valley and the wreck behind, and the stars opened above them like a sea of light. And the girl looked ahead with quiet eyes and steady hands, and the human glanced at her and felt a strange calm settle inside. They did not know what was waiting, but they were no longer alone, and that made all the difference in a universe filled with shadows and secrets. The stars moved around them like glowing rivers flowing past the ship as it sailed through space, quiet and fast. And inside the small cabin, the human watched the controls while the alien girl sat beside him, her hands resting on her lap, and her gaze locked on the wide screen in front of them, filled with stars and distant lights that blinked like silent watchers. Neither of them spoke as the hours passed and the ship continued forward, heading toward the dark zone she had pointed 2, and the closer they got, the more the human noticed the strange readings on the scanner. Odd energy, waves that came and went like breaths in the void, and signals that had no source and no name. The girl leaned forward and pointed at one of the flickering signals and then made a gesture with her fingers, crossing them over her chest, and the human understood that it meant danger or maybe warning, and he nodded and adjusted the ship's path to avoid the edge of the strongest signal. They passed an old station floating in silence with no lights and no movement and pieces of metal drifting around it like frozen birds, and the girl looked at it for a long time, her face still and unreadable, and then she turned away and closed her eyes as if trying to forget something buried deep inside her memory. The human did not ask questions because he knew some pain needed time and silence to heal, and instead, he focused on the journey, checking systems and keeping the path smooth and watching for anything strange or hostile. And as they crossed into the edge of the dark zone, the stars behind them began to fade, and the light ahead grew thin and cold. Inside the ship, the warmth remained, but the silence grew heavier like a blanket, pressing down on their shoulders. And the girl opened her eyes again and reached into her small pouch, pulling out a broken piece of crystal that shimmered with pale light, and she held it close to her chest, whispering words he could not understand, but felt deep in his bones. Suddenly the ship shook slightly as if something passed near it unseen, and the alarms blinked once, then stopped, and the human checked the controls and found nothing wrong, but the scanner kept flashing with static and random bursts of unknown code, and he knew this was not a place of safety. He turned to her and asked with a gesture if she wanted to turn back, and she looked at him with calm eyes and shook her head, and then pointed forward again as if to say, "This is the only way," and he nodded once and returned to the controls, setting the ship on manual and guiding it with care through the growing shadows. After a while, they reached a cluster of floating rocks, turning slowly like a silent dance, and hidden between them was a shape, long and dark and half buried in the debris, and the girl gasped softly and pressed her hand to the screen, her fingers trembling, and the human slowed the ship and brought it closer, watching the strange shape reveal itself. It was a ship older than anything he had seen, and covered in symbols and marks that glowed faintly in the dark, and some parts were broken and others looked melted, but the core remained untouched. And the girl whispered again, her voice full of emotion and memory and pain, and he knew this was where it all began. He docked the ship to a small open port on the side, and the airlock hissed and opened slowly, and they stepped inside the old vessel together, the lights flickering above them and the silence pressing in from all sides like a presence watching their every move. The girl moved with care, her steps slow and sure, as if she knew every corner and every path, and the human followed her, scanning the walls and picking up faint signals of life, energy and old memories locked in the metal like ghosts waiting to be seen. They reached a chamber filled with strange machines and a large console covered in dust and cracked glass, and the girl walked to it and placed the crystal in a small slot, and the room lit up with soft blue light, and the walls shimmered as if remembering her and welcoming her home. The console came alive, and a voice filled the room, speaking in a language the human did not know, but the girl understood, and her hands moved quickly over the controls, and images appeared on the walls showing a planet burning and ships falling and people running and something massive in the sky opening like a wound. The human stepped back and watched as the images told a story of war and loss and betrayal and escape, and he realized she was not just a survivor, but a keeper of something ancient and powerful, and this place was not a ruin, but a key. She turned to him, and her face was full of sadness, but also strength, and she walked toward him and reached out her hand, and he took it without fear, and in that moment they were no longer two strangers, but allies bound by something greater than either of them could name. The room glowed with shifting lights as the crystal pulsed within the console, and the ancient ship slowly awakened from its long sleep, and the human stood beside the alien girl, watching the walls change into living memories, and the symbols moved like flowing rivers of thought, showing flashes of a past long buried under silence and shadow. The girl walked deeper into the chamber, her hand never leaving the console, as if drawing strength from it, and with every step more of the story unfolded, revealing a secret that reached beyond the stars and beyond their understanding. And the human followed close behind, trying to make sense of the shapes and sounds that filled the air like Forgotten songs. The ship had not simply crashed, it had been chased, driven from its homeworld by something unseen, something vast and cruel, and the girl was not just a survivor. She was chosen to protect something ancient and powerful, something the enemy could never be allowed to find. And as the truth unfolded, the human felt the weight of their mission grow heavier with each breath. He looked at her face, calm and focused, and saw not fear but purpose, and he understood that she had come here not just to remember, but to finish something, and whatever it was, it would not be easy and it would not be safe, and yet he felt no desire to turn back, only a rising fire inside that refused to fade. She placed both hands on the console and spoke again in her soft, glowing language, and the floor beneath them shifted slowly, revealing a staircase leading downward into the heart of the ship, where no light reached and no sound moved, and they descended together. Step by step into the deep unknown. The walls grew tighter, and the air colder, and the energy thicker as they entered a chamber shaped like a dome with carvings on every surface, and in the center was a pedestal with a single orb resting atop it, pulsing gently, like a heartbeat, and the girl approached it with reverence and silence, as if standing before a living god. She turned to the human and motioned him forward, and he stepped beside her and looked at the orb, and for a moment he saw nothing, then everything. His mind filled with images of stars being born and destroyed, voices of thousands crying out, and then silence again, as if the universe itself had exhaled and gone still. He stumbled back, breathless and shaken, and she caught his hand, steadying him with surprising strength, and he looked at her eyes glowing with tears, not of pain but memory, and she pointed to the orb, then to her heart, then to the stars, as if to say, "This must be carried, this must be protected, and this must reach the place where it can shine again." He nodded slowly, understanding not with words, but with something deeper, and she reached out and lifted the orb carefully, and it responded to her touch, glowing brighter and warmer, and the chamber filled with soft light that pushed back the darkness like dawn, breaking through a storm. As they turned to leave, the ground shook slightly, and a low hum echoed through the ship, and the girl froze, eyes wide and filled with fear, not from the ship, but from something else. Something outside, something that had finally found them, and the human grabbed her hand and pulled her forward, running up the steps. As alarms began to sound, they reached the main corridor just as the walls lit red, and the screen above showed a shape in the sky, black and massive and sharp, like a blade cutting through space, and the girl gasped and whispered one word over and over, a name or a warning or both, and the human knew this was the enemy, the one she had been running from all along. He activated the docking release and guided her into their small ship, now loaded with the orb and essential supplies, and the engines roared to life as the ancient vessel behind them began to shake and crack and break under the pressure of the dark force approaching. Fast like a storm without mercy, they launched into the void, with fire behind them and silence ahead, and the stars welcomed them like old friends, and the girl sat gripping the orb to her chest, eyes locked on the screen as the black shape followed close behind, growing closer every second, and the human flew with all his skill, weaving through debris and shadow, trying to buy them time. A blast of energy passed near them, and the ship shook violently, and warning lights flashed, but he held the controls firm and pushed the ship faster through a narrow gap between two burning asteroids, and behind them the enemy ship paused, unable to follow through the tight space, and the girl let out a breath she had been holding since they launched. They escaped the first strike, but the chase was not over, and they both knew it. And as the girl looked at the orb and then at the human, her eyes filled with something new. Not just fear, not just hope, but trust, the kind that only grows between two souls who have seen death and still chosen to stand. Together the stars passed like whispers as the ship flew faster than it ever had before, with alarms blinking and engines burning hot, and behind them the black enemy vessel chased without rest, its sharp frame cutting through the void like a silent predator. And inside the cockpit the human kept his hands steady, his breath slow, and his eyes locked on the path ahead as he guided them through the thinnest gaps in the debris field. Alien girl sat beside him, holding the glowing orb against her chest, her silver hair flowing with the ship's trembling, and her eyes filled with light and fear and strength. And though her voice was quiet, her presence was loud like a storm hiding in silence, and the human felt it like a pulse beside him, steady and unshaken, The enemy ship gained ground, moving through the chaos, without slowing, as if it could sense the orb and was drawn to it like a beast to heat. And the girl turned to the human and drew a quick shape on the screen with her finger. 3 lines forming a triangle with a dot in the center, and he recognized it from old maps, a symbol for a hidden gate and escape route. Used long ago in forgotten wars, he nodded and changed course, the ship turning sharply left and then upward, dodging through broken satellites and ancient wrecks, and the gate appeared ahead like a crack in the dark, a narrow line of blue. Humming with quiet energy, almost invisible to the eye unless you knew where to look, the ship rushed toward it, but just before they reached the gate, the black vessel fired a silent beam that sliced past their wing and sent sparks flying, and the ship spun twice before the human regained control, his hands moving fast and focused, and the girl gripped her seat tight, but did not cry out. They entered the gate in a burst of blue light, and everything shifted. The stars bent and the silence deepened, and for a moment time stretched like soft glass and then snapped back as they emerged into a hidden sector, a place not marked on any map, filled with green stars and strange floating stones that hummed with quiet life. The black ship did not follow, not yet, and the human let out a breath as he guided the vessel toward a nearby moon shaped like a spiral and covered in glowing vines, and they landed near a cave entrance hidden beneath the roots of a massive tree that pulsed with warm blue light inside. The cave, the air was cool and smelled of old earth and forgotten things, and the girl led the way, her steps sure as if guided by memory, and the orb in her hands pulsed with each breath, matching her heart, and the deeper they walked the more the walls glowed with symbols like the ones on the ancient ship. At the heart of the cave they found a chamber shaped like a circle with walls of crystal and a floor made of smooth stone, and in the center stood a tall figure made of metal and light, not alive, but not dead either, and it opened its eyes as they entered, glowing gold and soft. The girl stepped forward and spoke in her language, and the figure responded with a hum that filled the room and made the human skin tingle, and the orb floated from her hands and rose above the floor, spinning slowly as beams of light touched it from the walls and ceiling, and the chamber came alive with color and sound. Images filled the air, showing a time before the war, a time of peace and unity, when her people protected the stars with wisdom and care, and the orb was their key, a source of harmony that kept the balance. But something came from beyond, something dark and endless and hungry, and the guardians fell one by one until only fragments remained. The human watched in awe as the images faded and the light returned to the orb, now pulsing brighter than before, and the figure turned to them and spoke again in symbols that appeared in the air, and though he could not read them, the girl could, and her face changed from fear to hope as she looked back at him. She reached out and took his hand and placed it near the orb, and it responded to his touch, glowing even warmer, and the figure nodded slowly and stepped back into the wall, becoming still once more, and the orb settled between them, its energy now shared between the two. They returned to the ship together, and as they lifted off, the cave closed behind them, and the moon faded into mist, and the scanner blinked once, then went quiet, and the black ship appeared again in the distance, waiting, watching, knowing now that the orb had awakened and the chase would not end. But the girl was ready, and so was he, and as they moved into the stars once more, they knew the final path had begun, a journey not just to survive, but to bring light back into the places where darkness had ruled too long. The stars above were quiet, but the silence carried weight like the breath before a storm, and in the small ship flying through this ancient space, the human and the alien girl sat side by side, the glowing orb resting between them like a heartbeat shared, and its light touched them both, changing the air, the ship, the journey itself, as if the universe was listening behind them. The black ship followed close, no longer hiding, no longer hunting in shadows, but flying openly like a blade drawn and ready, and its engines left trails of smoke and ash through space as if burning the sky itself, and the scanners screamed warnings too fast to read, and the girl closed her eyes and placed both hands over the orb. The human reached for the controls, but they faded under his touch, and the ship began to move by itself, following a path that was not on any map, a path that curved through stars and light and memory, and the orb pulsed faster each time they passed near ancient places where broken ships floated like bones and forgotten satellites blinked like tired eyes ahead. The stars bent inward toward a spiral of golden fire, not a sun, not a gate. Not a planet, but something older, something alive and asleep and dreaming, and the girl opened. Her eyes now glowing with the same light as the orb, and she turned to him with a gaze filled with meaning and sorrow and hope. She pointed to herself, then to the orb, then to the spiral, and then to him, and he understood, not in words, not in logic, but in something deeper, that she had always been the key, not the orb, not the ship, not the past, but her. And now the time had come to give everything. He tried to speak, but she placed her fingers gently on his lips and shook her head, then reached forward and placed the orb into a chamber in the center of the ship, and it locked in with a hum that made the entire vessel glow and shift. And then she stood and walked into the light without fear. The ship opened from within like a flower, and she floated upward, lifted by the orb's energy, and her body changed not in shape, but in presence, her skin shining like the stars, her hair flowing like light, her eyes full of endless knowing, and she looked down at him one last time and smiled. Then the spiral opened wide, and the black ship fired one final beam. A strike meant to end everything, but the girl raised her hand, and the light from the orb answered, and the beam turned into wind and song and vanished like dust in water, and the spiral reached forward and embraced her. The human stood alone, now watching as the light swallowed her, and the orb and the ship, and then faded, leaving behind only stars and silence and memory. And in that silence he felt her presence, not gone, not lost, but spread across space like the first light of dawn. He drifted in the quiet for a long time, or maybe no time at all, and then the ship came back to life, rebuilt, remade, renewed, and the controls returned under his fingers, and the path appeared ahead. No longer empty, no longer dark, but lined with stars brighter than before, and he knew what he had to do. He flew forward, carrying her story, her sacrifice, her power, and every planet he passed turned to watch, and every signal he sent reached ears that had forgotten how to hope. And slowly the galaxy began to change, not fast, not loud, but steady like rivers carving stone. He spoke her name in every tongue and told her story in every place, and the people listened and remembered and began to rebuild not just their homes, but their trust and their hearts. And the stars above shone warmer each time her name was whispered into the night. Years passed, and the black ships no longer came, and the darkness shrank little by little, and in the corners of the universe children were born with silver eyes and glowing lines on their skin, and they carried her legacy in their blood and their dreams, and they knew the stars were safe because someone had once believed in something greater than fear. The human grew old, but never stopped moving, never stopped telling her story, never stopped flying, and when his time came, the stars themselves opened for him, and he stepped into the light, not with sorrow, but with peace, knowing he would see her again in the place where time had no hold, and far beyond where any map could reach, where no ship had ever gone. There was a soft blue light pulsing in the quiet, and if you listened closely you could still hear her laugh in the starlight and feel her warmth in the wind between worlds.